Good morning, everybody. We're glad to have you here this morning. I'm not used to that either. This morning we're going to go through the data-driven decision-making process. I'm going to start out and present with you guys through the first hour, and then we'll take a break. After that, Steve is going to take over, and Daniel's going to sort of be supporting both of us throughout both presentations. Just to start out so you know what this process is that we're going to be talking about, we're going to start with collection, and that's what you get me for all morning. And then the next step is analysis and graphing, so how to take that information that you've collected and turn it into a meaningful graph or meaningful graph or chart, and then how to interpret that data into a meaningful discussion so that you can use that to make decisions about the behavior of your students and where to go with that information. So throughout this presentation, if you look in your PowerPoint, at the bottom of each of the slides, it has a little icon that's going to help you keep track of where we are. So anything that's falling under the collection category has a little clipboard at the bottom right corner, I believe, of your slide. Anything relative to analysis and graphing is going to have that little graph at the bottom of your slide, and anything related to interpretation will have the little man with his gears spinning at the bottom of your slide. The green will be analysis and graphing, and all of the red will be interpretation. But of course, on your black and white slides, that's not something you're going to have access to, thus the little icons for when you go back, you can kind of, if you're looking for a particular section, you can jump right to that section. So when we talk about collection, what we're talking about is the chance to observe the child's behavior and record what we see. The key word there is observe. So it's not something that we're thinking back and going, well, I think he did this at this time for this reason. It's something that's happening in real time as these behaviors are occurring. The second thing for analysis and graphing, then that's taking that information, plugging it into some sort of program to give you meaningful information. We're going to show you how to do that with an Excel spreadsheet, and those are, we have some ISRC behavior graphing templates on our website that is the template that you all downloaded before you came here today. So we're going to give you an opportunity to work with that, give you some data, actually plug it in so that you can see how this program works, so you're not so fearful when you have a behavior intervention plan meeting or an IEP meeting and you want to bring some nice data and you're not really sure how to get that data. These are some tools that you can access. And then interpretation. So when you're sitting at that meeting and people are looking to you because now you are the member of the behavior team and you are the guru and you have the expertise and you have the knowledge, and they say to you, okay, so what does this mean? That's what this red section is going to be about, helping you understand that data and use that data to design interventions and to determine if your interventions are being successful, or then how to revamp those interventions to match the need of your student. The first thing we want to talk about is why it's so important to collect our data, because everybody says, and the big push right now is data, 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 right? You go to your supervisor, you say, oh, this student in my class is having a problem, and they say, what kind of data have you taken on it? I mean, that's really, everything is data driven these days. We don't have these cardiac assessments anymore, is what I like to call them. It feels like, I think, it seems like we're not doing cardiac assessments anymore. I stole that from someone and I wish I could remember who it was so I could give them credit, but I don't know. We're not doing cardiac assessments anymore. Instead, we need hard evidence. We need the data. We can't just feel like we think we know what's happening or feel like this is the best course of action. We need to have some evidence to support our decisions. Again, with RTI, you're all familiar with that, and this is just that same model applied to behavior. When you collect the data, then it helps you identify patterns of that student's behavior. So when you bring that to the meeting and they say, does this happen at a certain time of day? Does it happen a certain time of the week? Does it happen with a certain teacher or in a certain class, structured or unstructured settings? Those are all conversations that we have at these meetings, and without this data, you might not have the actual answers to that. You know, a lot of times we hear, well, we think Mondays are really bad because he or she has been home all weekend with less structure and now they come back to school and they have a hard time adjusting. Well, again, we think or we feel, but we don't have the evidence. So that's why that's really important. It'll help us identify those patterns for sure. Once we can identify the pattern, then that helps us predict when this behavior might occur sometime in the future. And if we can predict when it might occur sometime in the future, then that helps us be able to be preventative instead of reactive. We can try to prevent that situation. Maybe we can make some environmental adjustments or some curriculum adjustments, some support for the teachers or for that student. But once we make those adjustments, then we might be able to kind of preemptively ward off that behavior, and that's really what we're looking for. The goal number 2 is because they tell us to do it. ISBE mandates it, RTI is pushing for it. Not only is it just best practice and something that we should do because it's good and it helps us guide our decisions, but it's something that we have to do because ISBE tells us we have to. On the IEP, that's a legal document, and on that document we have the component of the behavior intervention plan. In that plan, it asks about your data. So you have to have that data. You can't just show up to the IEP meeting or a behavior intervention plan review and say, well, we think he's getting better. Or, oh yeah, her behavior is getting worse. We can't say that without the evidence. So because of the legality of it, because of the mandates for it, we have to have some hard evidence, and sometimes that's tricky. A lot of teachers and a lot of professionals will say, we know we have to have it, but we're not really sure how to collect the data. We're not really sure what data to collect. So we're going to talk about that some more today. Another thing is when it's on the behavior plan, you see this big word here, quantitatively describe the identified target behavior before, during, and after an intervention is utilized. So again, not just okay, here's our behavior intervention plan and this is how we're going to collect data, but what was that behavior like before we put our intervention into place? What is our behavior like now that we have an intervention in place? And then should we decide to remove that intervention, how does that behavior maintain or not maintain once we remove that intervention? So again, really kind of an experiment, if you will, to make sure that what we're doing is best for our student and that it's actually working. Quantitative versus qualitative. The quantitative is what is the encouraged type of data collection. Qualitative is discouraged. Quantitative is actual numbers. You counted it, you tallied it, you timed it, you know exactly specifically when and how many or how much. Qualitative, again, is more of that cardiac assessment. Well, I think last Friday he had a tantrum that lasted 10 minutes. Well, did it really last 10 minutes or did it just feel like 10 minutes because you were totally stressed out? It was the end of the week, the end of the day, and you just wanted to go home. Happy hour was calling your name, you know, so you're like, oh my gosh, do I have to make all these phone calls to parents? Or, you know, you're already focusing on something else. So maybe it feels like it was longer or worse than it really was. Again, the importance of having the hardcore, significant data that could be measured and could be counted. So, on to my first little clipboard icon, which I'm super excited about. I hope all of you can appreciate my dorkiness. Data collection. How do we collect data? There are so many tools. There are, let's face it, so many behaviors in our classrooms that we're like, where do we start or what do we do? We just want to show you that these are a bunch of different tools that you can use to have that data. We're not here to tell you that this is the one way to collect data and this is the behavior you should collect data on. It really has to match the needs of your classroom, of your students, of your plans that you're writing or the interventions that you're putting into place. So on our website, we have the ISRC data collection template, which is what you downloaded. Check-in, check-out is a system that a lot of you are familiar with if you've been coming to these trainings over and over again. For those of you who are new, you might not be so familiar with it. Really briefly, you basically have a couple of goals for the day, and then you have the times of the day or the classes, and it's basically a grid. At the end of each one of those chunks of time, the adult evaluates the student's behavior, maybe on a scale of 0, 1, or 2. 0, they did not meet their goal at all. 1, they kind of so-so met their goal. 2, they really met their goal well. They were, you know, top-notch in that area. And then you can take that intervention or that information and help you know how their behavior was across the day. It also gives them a time to really link up with the adults in their life. It really gives them a chance to get some positive feedback and to help redirect them. If they are kind of falling back in first or second hour, then they don't have a terrible day the rest of the day. You can kind of pull them back and kind of give them a boost or a pep talk that maybe they need to make it through the rest of the day. A point system, a point system, something that a lot of you are very familiar with. A lot of us use this as a classroom management technique in our classrooms already. Maybe there's a certain number of points that they can earn for different expectations throughout the day, or kind of bonus points. Smiley faces, very popular in an elementary program. You know, did you have a good job at math and you get a smiley, or were you really a pill in math and you get a frown? So that's another system we're really familiar with. And then the red, yellow, green light is another system that a lot of people are familiar with. Green is, you know, you're right on target. Yellow, and again, it can vary depending on your classroom and your program how you define it, but yellow sometimes is you needed a warning, or maybe you were kind of on the fence of some ill-advised behavior, and then red is maybe you needed a note home, or you had to go to the office, or you had to go in timeout, or whatever your criteria is that you use at that point for that. One thing that I want to say about the Smiley Faces program is I have a student that I was working with, and they had a smiley face for each unit of instruction throughout the day. So they did spelling, and then they had counting, and then they had reading, and etc. Well, this student's big challenge was those transition times. So transitioning from recess back to math, from PE back to social studies and whatnot. So what we did is, instead of changing their whole system, we just had them put smiley faces in between each of those chunks of time. So again, like a really simple way that you can adapt something that you're already using to make sure you're collecting data on the things that you need information for. If all we had was these 10 times of academic instruction throughout the day, but the big concern was transition, those 10 chunks throughout the day were not giving us the information that we needed. So by simply just using the same system that we had, adding this one little extra piece, we could really see how this behavior was manifesting itself throughout the day, and if it was between indoor and outdoor times, or if it was between academic and more leisure rec times. So that really helped us address that student's behavior adequately. A lot of you have seen this. It's available on our website. It's also part of the sample that's in your packet today with some data on it. This is just a simple data collection tool that you can modify. We have, you know, in hour chunks, 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11. If your class periods are 35 minutes, download this off of our website, and you can easily change the times to match the times of your day. Maybe you don't really care the time per se, so maybe instead of 8 to 9, it says science. And instead of 9 to 10, it says social studies. And 10 to 11, it says math. So again, you can adjust this to meet the needs of your behavior or your classroom. And then across, oh, we're somehow missing a line right here. But then you have it across the week. So again, you can see those patterns. Is Monday worse than Wednesday? Is Friday worse than Tuesday? So you can see the difference across behavior, across the day, and across the time of day, which really gives you a good picture. A lot of people at this point freak out and say, oh my gosh, do we have to take all of this data every single day, forever? And the answer is no, and we'll get into that later, but just so you can put your mind at rest at this point, we're not telling you to collect data 24/7 on every kid in your class. Here's another, similar to maybe a check-in, check-out type of data collection. Here's our goals: to talk nice and to not have any teasing, to make sure that you tell the truth and not make any excuses. Oh yeah, right, like any of our kids do that. And then to be helpful or to not have any bullying. So again, these are 3 targets that this particular student was really focusing on. These are not just an arbitrary set of goals that we're trying to tell you to use with every student. These are the particular goals of that student. An important piece is to make sure that there's some goals on there that they can actually be successful at. You don't want to pick the 3 things that we absolutely know they cannot do and put them on this form, because then that does not give them an opportunity for any kind of positive adult interaction, which is part of the point of a check-in, check-out system. Down here at the bottom, again, I was saying maybe a 0, 1, or 2 scale. So here we've defined that 0 is not successful 25% of the time. For 1, so-so is 25 to 75% of the time. And then rock star, met your goal 75% of the time or more. So that's really important to have that specific criterion, because if they have different teachers or a different sub or whatever, they might go, oh yeah, you had a really great day. And really 50% of the time, he or she was off task or was bullying or whatever. So you really want to make sure that you have that clearly defined criteria, so no matter who is taking the data, that it's the same. And then down here, that not only for the points, but for the definition of these things, we have defined what those expectations are specifically. Here's another simplified version of that, afternoon and morning. So maybe they are a kindergarten student and they're mainstreamed in kindergarten for the morning, and then they're self-contained DHH in the afternoon, or something like that, where there's a real clear division of AM and PM. Maybe you just give them an overall rating. Some of the downsides to this is that it's just an overall 1 score for what is likely several hours of time. So if within that 2-hour chunk you have some variation, you're not going to get that clear of data from it. But again, we'll address the different extremes of data collection that you might or might not need depending on the behavior you're looking at. Then how to total and how to give them a score. It's really important so that you have something that you can graph and analyze. Here's another system that one of our students uses. I'm not that familiar with this intervention as it's not one of my students, but it's the Spider-Man track, and the student is trying to earn up his way to Spider-Man. At that point, he will be rewarded with some kind of free time or tangible object. Question in the back.
Yes, just back up with these slides.
Sure.
One of the places I get hung up is even when you make these charts and you put the behaviors, then when you're giving them points for that day, 0, 1, or 2, that is still a subjective cause, is it not? So you're saying in this classroom, okay, 50% of the time, you weren't having this behavior, but even, you're not really tallying. So as much as I say it's data, there still is that subjective piece to it.
Yes, that is correct. And so depending on how serious of the data that you need, which we'll talk about that later, do you need more of an overall picture, or do you need an actual tally count of exactly how many times this happened? The other thing is something more subjective like that might be something that you could do day in and day out as the classroom teacher while you're teaching. Okay, well, I had to devote this much time and this much attention to this student today, whereas while you're up in the front teaching, you might not be able to check their on or off task for all 50 minutes because you have all the other kids in your classroom. Does that make sense? So depending on what your resources are, you might be able to use something a little more flexible for a day-to-day collection, and then maybe have some support to push into the classroom to really get some specific data at various points, maybe throughout a week or throughout a month, or as kind of a temperature check. And then again, depending on if this is your sole form of data collection, or maybe this is just an additional piece for the student to kind of stay aware of his or her behavior. So it really depends on how you use that data collection sheet.
We do check in, check out. It's like very specific as to what the target is. Like respectful to teachers, respectful to peers, completed your homework, those kind of things. But in middle school, we let the kids kind of actually give themselves the points, and it seems to work really well. They really, I think it's just, we use it more as, like you said, just kind of maintaining that behavior. We're not necessarily collecting data because we have a behavior problem, but just to maintain. Do you have all your stuff? Are you ready for home? Is everything written in your assignment notebook? And we check in morning, before lunch, and then before they go home. But using them as a tool to actually rate themselves, and honestly, they do, they'll take points off if they, realize it. And we also check in with each other, with the teachers, to say, so he was ready for music today because he wasn't yesterday. So kind of getting the kids involved works well for us as far as the check in, check out.
Perfect. And does that help answer some of your questions over here, how that might work in 2 different ways. Steve?
Also, possibly developing a matrix if you're going to use a 1 through 3 number, because if you got more than one teacher using that scale, you have to be agreeing upon what you're giving the numbers for. So creating a matrix which shows what each number represents.
So similar to like a rubric where you would have the different behaviors and have 1, 2, 3, 4. A 1 means this, a 2 means this, a 3 means that. Again, it's still somewhat subjective, but it's a lot more consistent then at that point, where it's a certain number of prompts or it's a certain number of time, and then you can have a little bit more flexibility that way. Okay, so how do we, this is part of what we were just talking about, how do we pick our data collection tool? Which form or which style or which type of collection is going to give us the information that we need? And which one is going to be the most useful? Do we need collection all day, every day? Do we need just a snapshot? And we need to make sure that it's really relative to our target behavior. I've seen very often where teachers will, okay, you know, we have these challenging behaviors, they're gung-ho, we go out and we collect a bunch of data, and we are trying to collect data on like 10 different things, and nobody's really sure what their top priority is. Well, maybe for a day or 2 to help you figure out what your priority should be, that might be helpful, but otherwise that's exhausting and it's not really useful because it's inconsistent. You have too many targets that you're trying to focus on. So really you want to make sure that the type of collection you're doing really matches with the behavior that you're trying to focus on. Is it specific enough to identify the patterns related to that target behavior? So if we're charting on and off task, let's say, for example, and we decide to do a frequency tally, I'm going to put a check on this Post-it note on my desk every time Jonathan is off task. Well, today we get started, Jonathan is off task, I put my check mark, and guess what? Jonathan never comes back to task for the rest of my period. So I have 1 incident of off-task behavior for an entire hour. Is that helpful information? Is that specific enough for the behavior that I'm looking to address? No. So then we say, okay, I'm going to count how many times I prompt Jonathan to return to task. So we get started, Jonathan strays off task, I tell Jonathan come back. When I tell him that, I give him a little check mark on my piece of paper. We keep going, Jonathan stays on task for 45 seconds. I give Jonathan another prompt to get back on task. I give him another tally mark. I'm doing this throughout my lesson. Now I have 42 prompts in 1 period for on or off task behavior. Does that give me a better picture of how much Jonathan was on or off task during that class period? Yes. Is it still as specific as I could get? No. What are some ways that I might be able to get more specific information? Oh, I thought Mark was going to answer. He's been here so much. The video guy was going to jump in. Marissa?
You have somebody else that can use a stopwatch and actually time the amount of time on and off task.
Okay, that's a great idea. Have someone in the back of your classroom sit with a stopwatch while Jonathan is on task. Your time is ticking away. As soon as Jonathan stops being on task, you stop your stopwatch. As soon as Jonathan returns back to task, you can start your stopwatch again. Great thing. You probably need some manpower for that, right? Because I can't be up in the front of my classroom teaching and manning this stopwatch. So you would need to maybe recruit the support of a social worker, a psychologist, your supervisor, maybe create a triad like Rick talks about and have some other teachers come in and support you during their times off. Also, ISRC is available for data collection coaching where we could come out and we could take some data like that for you so that you have that piece of information for your planning. Anyone else have any other strategies that they've used? Linda? Type of prompts.
Is it because he's not understanding the work? Is that he's just, his attention is going someplace? What's really going on?
Okay, so instead of just an arbitrary check, he got a prompt, check, he got a prompt, check, he got a prompt, more of maybe that ABC format, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. So what was the behavior, or what type of prompt you could put on there, so that would be the consequence. So the behaviors would pretty much all be the same, but what type of instruction was going on would be your antecedent, and then what type of prompt did they get would be your consequence, and that would give you a more comprehensive picture of those prompts that Jonathan was getting for his on or off task behavior. Somebody else back here had another suggestion, Doran?
You could also vary the type of prompts by proximity, a verbal prompt versus going over and standing next to the student to see if that helps to change the behavior.
Great, and ISRC does have some resources for that. I don't believe they're on our website, but they are in some of our training modules where it really defines the different types of prompts and the continuum of prompts, because a verbal prompt versus a full physical assist redirect is a very different thing. So you write a goal that says, Jonathan will remain on task 50% of the time with prompts. What kind of prompts? Because then if it's the same goal year after year, it doesn't look like Jonathan's making any progress. But last year we had to like physically take his hand to write his name. This year I can just tap on his paper and he'll write his name. And then next year maybe I could just say, Jonathan, write your name, and he does it. That's huge gains, right? That's a big difference for Jonathan. However, we can't really show that if we just say generically with prompts. So identifying specifically the continuum of prompts that you're using. Anybody else?
Sometimes we do latency data, and we'll use a motivator for a teacher. So because it's very hard to watch time, sometimes it's hard to stop that watch clock. So we create a partial interval, and we just have her put loose rubber bands on. So if she's teaching, the motivator goes off, and he's still not, depending on how many we set it up for minutes, 5 minutes, whatever our increment is, she can just move it over to the one hand, so that she can go back to her sheet and fill in those intervals.
Okay, great. So chunks throughout the day, whether that student was kind of on or off task during that given chunk, and then you could easily chart that or tally that with rubber bands on your wrist or maybe paper clips in your pocket, an abacus, old school abacus, right? Sitting right up there at the front of your classroom, and you could just flick a bead over. Which brings up another point that some teachers say, well, but then they'll know I'm taking data on them. Well, that's okay, because that very well might serve as an intervention altogether. If they know every time you have to address their behavior, you're flicking a bead, they're like, ooh, I did it again. So it's a visual for them to know, whoops, I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing, and it also serves for you as a data collection piece. So something to think about. Sometimes we want our data to be discrete, but at other times it might not necessarily matter. It might actually serve as a little bit of an intervention.
What about other students in the classroom who are asking what you're doing? Do you identify who you're doing that for? I mean, that's not what I would do. In the past, like with the check mark system or something on the board, I go under the child's name, I'll just do it. But is there anything else that you would say to the class to kind of...
The question is, if it's a public thing where it is visual and others in the class can see that you're taking data and other students are asking you, what are you doing? Who is that about? Or whatever. Do you say, oh, well, Tommy, you know, I'm keeping track of how many times he really irritates me today. That's not what we're going to do. I'm taking some data on the behavior in our class, or, you know, it's some information for, you know, for Miss Raven, and you don't need to worry about that. You know, just kind of a general blanket statement of, this is just some information that I need, or, oh, my boss told me to keep track of some things, you know, I'm just doing my job, stuff like that. And we get that question a lot as far as the intervention piece too, and they say like, oh, well, why does Tommy get to chew gum if none of the rest of us get to chew gum? And my answer, always blanket across the board, is because he needs it. And I have never had any response from kids other than, ooh, yeah, you're right. You know, they know who the kids are in the class that are really bringing the rest of them down. And if you just simply say, he or she needs it, they go like, yeah, they get it. The kids are aware enough that they know that maybe they don't need it, and then usually they're okay with it. And sometimes if it's something a little more novel, like the ball or the wiggle cushion or something like that, giving them an opportunity to sit on it one time, and the kids who don't need it, that's usually sufficient. They're like, okay, yeah, that was cool. Moving on, it's much easier for me to sit in my chair, you know? So just kind of letting the novelty of that wear off. Steve, did you have something to add, or did I?
Well, often when we go to classroom more than once, we'll go back and they'll say, are you here to see Tommy? They pretty well know what we're doing.
Yep, that's true. Our kids are on the ball, to say the least. We know what they're up to, and they know what we're up to. So. Anybody else have any other examples of how you might be able to get some really specific data based on your different tools? One other that I want to point out for specifically on and off task is like a timed interval sampling, which I know we've talked about in previous trainings here, where you set up every 15 seconds or every 1 minute or every 5 minutes, and you have another observer in the back of your room, and at 9:01 I'm going to look at Sarah, and if Sarah is on task, she gets a check for on task, and if she's off task, she gets a check for off task. Then I don't care, myself as the observer, not myself as the teacher, what Sarah does for the rest of that entire 1 minute, and at 9:02 I look up, I feast my eyes on Sarah's happenings, and I decide, is she on task or off task, yes or no, and I don't look again until 9:03, where I feast my eyes on Sarah and her behavior, and I mark once again on task or off task. You would take that 20 minutes, maybe up to the whole entire class period, depending on the sampling of the behavior, and that gives you a more precise percentage of time, like we were talking about on a 0, 1, or 2 scale. Okay, well, was it really 25% of the time? Was it really closer to 75% of the time? Again, that is not a realistic data collection piece for the classroom teacher in the front of the room, but it is something that an outside observer or a teaching partner would be able to take for you. I have seen it as extreme as like every 10 seconds, 15 seconds, and then I've also seen it up to maybe about 5 minutes. Another piece of that is sometimes your little Sarah might be off task 50% of the time, but if you look around the room, every other student is also off task 50% of the time. So while then you have this great chunk of information that says Sarah is off task 50% of the time, you're not really addressing that all of the other kids are off task 50% of the time, and that that's actually very appropriate or age appropriate or classroom norm, as it may be. So sometimes you can then take Sarah's temperature and a peer. So you pick one other kid in the classroom and you look to see how much on or off task that other student is as well. So that's a way to get some really specific information that you can then use to develop a plan and develop an intervention and know exactly what the behavior is, when it's happening, and what the intensity of that behavior is. And then you get to the legality of, will it satisfy the requirements of the BIP, of the IEP, or of RTI? And so depending on how your goals and your plan is written, you'll have to make sure that your data is specific enough to do that. So those are a bunch of different tools that you can either create, or if you're not sure how to create that, you can let us know and we can help you make those tools. But those are a bunch of tools that are available to you. We talked about this, but just so I don't skip this fabulous slide, the ease and use of practicality of the tool. Is this a tool that the classroom teacher can use while she or he is up in the front of the classroom? Or is this something where you need some support from another staff member or supervisor or ISRC member to come and help you with that? Other examples, not necessarily related to the tool, but of the data collection process itself, is the staff cooperative. If you, as the behavior support person for your co-op or your district or your area, says to another teacher, well, this is how you could collect some data on that, and that person will not do it, that's a problem, right? And that's not, that has nothing to do with the tool or the data collection process or system. It has to do with some other outside variables that might be impacting your ability to get the data that you need. Understaffed, again, if you need some very specific timed interval data at every 15 seconds and you don't have an extra person that could come into your room for you, that's a problem, and that's where you can tap into some other resources such as ISRC or talking with your supervisor to see if there might be able to be some accommodations scheduling wise. Untrained or undertrained staff. You all have been coming to these presentations for several years now, and so you've been working with data and you've been working with behavior plans, and you have a really good idea of how this process works. Somebody brand new to the team or brand new to the district, or somebody that's been around forever and data collection was really not a top priority, that staff person, you could say, oh, here's this, this little chart, and just real quick, every time they're aggressive, jot that down and we'll be good to go. And you walk out of the room and it seems simple to you because we've been doing it for all this time, that staff person might be really overwhelmed and not really sure what that means or how that works. So working with that. And then overworked staff. I mean, let's face it, we all have a lot to do throughout the course of our day, and to think about adding one more task onto our plate is really overwhelming sometimes. So trying to work with the teacher or the assistant, try to work with the supervisor and see how we might be able to support that, so that not only the student has the resources and the support that they need, but that the staff people have the resources and the supports that they need. Time and resources. So again, if we are thinking that we need to do this really intensive timed interval collection, but our staff is overworked and we don't have time and, then you could simplify the tool and you can, think back to that Spider-Man track, use something like that. But again, understand that the compromise to that is that your data is not going to be as specific. It's not going to show you as strong of a pattern, but it's more of just kind of a temperature check. So at the very beginning of an intervention, something like that might not serve as really adequate specific data collection, but maybe something like Lisa was addressing to kind of maintain behaviors that you've already established and you've already taught in your classroom. Okay. So we've picked our tool, we know what we're looking for, and now we're getting ready to collect our data. So we need to make sure that we have a really clear definition. I know we hammer this over your heads every time that we're up here talking, but this is probably the single most important piece of the data collection process. Because if you don't have a clear picture of what that behavior is that you're trying to focus on, one teacher says that aggression is spitting, and the other teacher let the spitting go because she thought, well, he's not really touching anyone, so does that really count as aggression? And so you get skewed data. Again, it needs to be very specific. So when we decide on our tool, the next step is to really not only decide on the behavior, but how are we defining that behavior? I like to kind of sit in the team and talk about, is it this or is it that? And I kind of play devil's advocate, and sometimes people like me for that and sometimes they don't. But I say, well, what about this? Okay, well, aggression is anytime he puts his hands on another student. And so then I get up and I demonstrate and I say, well, if he does this, is that aggression? And they go like, oh, yeah. And somebody else is over here going, well, no, because he was just trying to get his attention or whatever. And so really kind of, as adults, maybe even role-playing through some of these things to make sure that you know the yeses and the nos of this is aggression or this is not, or this is off task and this is not. I've had several hard of hearing students that will not maintain eye contact with the teacher. However, as an observer in the back of the room, that student can still answer every question as it comes up. So while they visually look like they're off task because their eyes are not on the teacher, biologically or physiologically or whatever the word would be, they are actually attending and they are taking in the information and they are still able to respond. So just kind of being aware of how for each student on or off task or aggression or whatever might look differently. Yes?
Bring to the student's attention that their behavior is incorrect, because it may be okay at home.
Mm-hmm.
It may be okay to hit your sibling at home, so you bring that behavior to school, and you think because so-and-so took your toy or so-and-so did something to you, it's okay to swat at them.
Absolutely.
So maybe, bring it to their attention, you cannot do this in school.
Absolutely.
You understand that it's not okay.
Absolutely. And we talk about that a lot with the positive behavior support system, setting your classroom expectations and really teaching those expectations to your students. So I think Lisa was saying, are you respectful, are you responsible, and are you safe? And those are kind of 3 overall goals that they have in their classroom, and they evaluate those at the end of every time. So maybe they would say, ooh, remember today when Millie took your toy and you lobbed him upside the head? Well, that's not safe behavior or that's not respectful behavior. And really just talking the student through that to make sure, because we all come from different walks of life. We all have different baggage and different experiences. And like you said, at home, maybe I'm the youngest and I have all big brothers, and by golly, that is how I get my toy back. If I don't swat him upside the head, that toy is gone for life, and it was my favorite toy. So just really understanding where our students come from, and that's a piece that comes in not only in that early stages of making sure that our expectations are known and that we're teaching our expectations, but something that will come at the very end as well when you're designing your intervention and you're at the full individualized behavior plan, where you might say, well, this is something that's appropriate at home, so maybe we need to do some extra role play, maybe we need to find some video clips, maybe we need an older mentor, you know, maybe this child is in 1st grade and we can get a 5th grader to kind of be his social buddy to teach him the ins and outs of being appropriate at school. So not only is that something we do as a foundation, but that might also be something we do a lot more intensively as an individualized intervention. Yes?
That we do is, you know, when you go through a target behavior with a group of adults, you say, okay, what is and what isn't. And so with the child, we do like a discrimination training. This is, this isn't. Because to say that was an example, but sometimes you have to say this is an example of what is appropriate, this is an example of what's not appropriate. So it's just like doing the target behavior with the adults, you're actually working through that target behavior with the kids.
Exactly. Yeah, I love that, kind of discriminating with the child. This is the expected behavior, this isn't the expected behavior. And just a key point to that to kind of put in the back of your mind is always have your student act out the expected or the desired behavior, but never, ever, ever let them role play or model the unexpected or the undesired behavior. That is something that the adults should do, and the students can give you feedback. Okay, Miss Raven is going to act goofy right now, and you need to tell me what I'm doing right and what I'm doing wrong, and have the student give you the feedback. Oh, well, you came in the room and you sat down, and that was really good, Miss Raven, but then you rocked back in your chair, and we don't rock back in our chair in this classroom or in this school. So as the teacher then modeling those undesired behaviors instead of letting the students do it, because the students think it's really funny and they want to interact the wrong behavior, but we really don't want to instill that in them. We don't want to give them any more opportunities to be bad.
We don't usually model, we take pictures because they actually do the behavior, so it's very easy. Get your camera, take a picture, and then we actually work on classification with them. You know, it's kind of like, okay, let's look at these pictures, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and they love the classification game. So
perfect. So we're taking a behavioral task and making it academic, which is awesome. You know, that's another drawback that we hear all the time. Well, I have so much to teach and our kids are so far behind. How can I take the time to teach them those expectations that we know that they need at school, because they're different from the ones they have at home or in the community. So if you take this behavioral task and you make it academic, then you're kind of killing 2 birds with 1 stone, and you're blending the 2 together. You know, I would love it if you could even take it a step further, make it a language experience activity. Then after they categorize, now they write a story about it, or they sign a story about it and we videotape them, something like that. So you can really tie the 2 together. Behavior and academics are not 2 separate entities. They are a cohesive piece that, you know, when you can address the behavior adequately, you have more time to teach then at the end. So for our definitions, say we're talking about off-task behavior. Here's just a sample that you might be able to use for a description of on or off-task behavior for yourself. Down at the bottom, just note it is noting duration and frequency. So it's not just how often so-and-so is off-task, but then it's the amount of time that they were off-task. Here's an example of some data collection that Daniel has actually done on some students where he did just that. This over here is the number of prompts that student got to return to task, and this is the total amount of time that student was off task in these durations. The G is for group work, the I is individual, and the LG is for a large group. So you can see not only time of day, but right on your data collection form you have the type of grouping where the student performs better and where the student has more challenges. And then you have not only the prompts, but the time off task. Again, with the stopwatch, not necessarily something that a teacher in the front of the room would be able to do, but maybe the teacher could count the prompts, and whoever's in the back of the room can take the time off task in actual measurable minutes. And so that just really helps you see that. On here, let's see if my magic works. It should show you the raw data sheet of how that was collected.
That's what I was going to ask you. Is that the accumulation of the total time off task, or what?
For each timed interval. So from here, they had 8 prompts, and their total time off task was 8 minutes and 57 seconds during that time period. Then it was 17 prompts, 4 minutes and 59 seconds. And then at the bottom of the pretty graph, it tells you this was the total number of prompts for one day and the total number of minutes or total amount of minutes off task for one day.
That to me doesn't seem like when they get 6 prompts but there's no time off task. Well, what were those prompts for, and what were, like, that's where it gets confusing, because why, if they're not off task, why are they getting prompts?
Daniel, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, we just defined it every time that the teacher had to tap them, call their name.
But that's
or
not off task, like the child wasn't off task?
Just to get their attention towards them. He might have just been looking away for a second. I think for off task, we said that as long as it was less than 5 seconds looking away, then it doesn't matter. And most of the kids in the class, I mean, you call the kids to come sit down, you know, as a group, so that's a problem. You know, yeah, we can tell the kids to initiate an activity. We actually measured on the side how many the other kids were getting typically. I think it was like 4 or 5 prompts in a 20-minute period. It was normal average for that class. And so we had a comparison.
So then let's just say, for argument's sake, that 4 was the average for the class, then anything over 4 would be a concern. And that makes sense how with the duration and the prompt and the frequency that you might have 6 prompts but 0 time off task, because if the teacher can catch it within those 5 seconds, then that was not counted as time off task. Their hands?
Just based on the data, then I'd be wondering, either is that the same teacher that's doing all the prompts, or is it like for the one that has none? Is it a class, like what's the subject, or what are the kind of prompts that they're using? Like why is it that he or she's able to do it with the simple prompt and have no off task? You know what I mean?
Exactly. And I'm not going to address that right now because that's something we're going to talk about more in the interpretation of the data. But I love that you must use data a lot in your programs because you're jumping right to that. You're seeing the data and you're already thinking, what is the story that this data is telling me? Is it a different teacher? Is it a same teacher? What was the subject? What was happening right before and right after? So you're using that data to really problem solve that behavior instead of, oh, okay, cool, he got 75 prompts. So what? You want to know, so what? So what does that mean? How did they get those prompts, and what does that look like throughout his or her day? So that's perfect. I love that you're thinking about that, and we're going to talk about that more in the other pieces. Question, Brenda, was that you?
Yeah, I think you answered it. I think he did too. But the 10:05 to 10:25, 9 prompts and 45 seconds off task. Did you only count the times he was off task every for 5 seconds or more? Is that what you said? Or?
I mean, that's just my preference. I think the kid a little wiggle room, because every kid's kind of nature. It's hard to stay focused for 20 minutes and then another 20 minutes and another 20 minutes. And so just to give a little wiggle room and be conservative. Because if the concern was, I mean, these are usually with little kids. And, you know, again, their attention span is going to be shorter. So, again, just playing on the conservative side, giving them just a wiggle room and
did you
showing
find
what is
every
it.
off-task thing, though, to make sure that it was going to be more? I mean, you couldn't predict if it was going to be 5 seconds or longer when they started, right?
This isn't, I mean, in these cases, this is the first time I've seen the kid. I've talked to the teachers, I've talked to the A's, I've watched the kids, so I kind of have an idea.
Okay.
And, you know, I kind of get a game plan before I actually sit down and stuff.
And so it might not be necessarily 2 separate stopwatches. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But you see the child look away and you kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, they haven't looked back, and you start your timer. Question over here? Yes.
I just wanted clarification on the prompts. So this was also just classroom prompts as part of those prompts, or just prompts to the kid?
To that specific student, or a direction that that student needed to follow.
It could be, get your math book and come over here, so it wasn't off task. That would count as a prompt?
If it was
please get your math book and come over to the table. Would that be a prompt?
Yes.
So that's how you can get prompts with no time off task.
True.
I mean, if he had 10 prompts, doesn't necessarily mean anything bad's going on. It was, I mean, this was a high frequency kid, and I actually changed the numbers in the last 7 weeks. This kid was about 140 prompts in about 2 hours. So I mean, it was just a considerable amount of time was required by the staff in the room to try and keep this kid attending. So, I mean, this is just, it's going to change this kid.
And this was the target student, but like Daniel said, he also took the temperature of the other students in the class, so you would know that. Exactly.
And you have the raw data sheet in your packet. You have in your packet a data collection sheet on both sides. It's the one that says Tuesday.
So on and off task, that's a big one. That's something that we hear a lot. Teachers are concerned about the students' ability to attend in class, as would make sense because you are trying to teach them, so they need to attend in order to obtain the information you're sharing with them. So on and off task is a big one, which is why we spent a lot of time talking about on and off task. Here's another one where maybe you're not going to necessarily take duration data on it because it's aggression. So isolated incidents of hitting or kicking or something like that. Now, if something like this manifested itself into what we like to throw around as the term of tantrum, and it was a culmination of a bunch of these behaviors over a period of time, then this type of just tally, yep, he hit, yep, he kicked, yep, he punched or whatever, that would not be appropriate because you would want that duration information because it was something that lasted for a long time. For this, we're talking about some very isolated, very specific, you know, there's a start and a stop. It's one hit and then that's it. They're not like hitting and hitting and hitting and hitting on another student. So they're aggressive when, and then it gives these situations. So you could see in this definition, spitting was something that the team wanted to consider as aggression, where there are other teams that would not determine spitting as an act of aggression. So depending on what your student handbook says, depending on what your team agrees on, and then you only need to include those that were observed in the past. So if the student never scratched or never hit or never kicked, then you just don't put that on the list. Yes?
Are we, as the professionals on things like the DIP, IEP, allowed to make a standard for what is, like say scratching, regular, so if a student scratches 4 times, that's okay, but if they scratch for 20 minutes and use other, how do we determine what's a regular scratch? I know this sounds, this is a crazy thing in our school right now.
I know you're not just pulling this out of a hat. What about?
Because obviously we all have to scratch at times, and there are times where the student does, but it's also his stress stimulation thing. What can we write so that if this ever came to, have to be presented or be challenged, that we didn't mark it down every time he scratched, or that we caught him when he was.
Right. A couple of different things just off the top of my head really quickly is that, again, you would want to make a do's and don'ts or an is not. So if the student scratches for less than, and I would probably say like seconds would be easier than 4 times, 1, 2, 3, 4. How do you know if they really scratched did their fingers crunch 4 times? That would be really hard to observe, but maybe an amount of time for more than 5 seconds, more than 10 seconds, until the appearance of the skin was red or until there was bleeding, or, do you know what I mean? You would look for something.
The escalation things of like using other things that are all not considered normal, but when it's just scratching, it's a hard thing to determine. Well, maybe the mom thinks we don't just mean scratch.
And so then maybe you would define scratching and excessive scratching. And so scratching would be da-da-da-da-da-da, excessive scratching would be, and you would outline the extremeness of that behavior. And again,
we're okay with that if we outline what is expected and what's not.
Yeah, because that would be your target behavior. That would be what you're focusing on. So you need to have a clear definition of that. However you outline that. And again, probably with a frequency might be more challenging than an amount of time or a visual, something that you could observe and see. Did they have redness? Were they bleeding? Or was there use of another object?
That's going to be very tough because if the body's heated and they scratch themselves, they're going to leave visual marks, whereas if they were not, if the body wasn't heated, they wouldn't. So things like that are a big consideration as well.
Yep, for sure. And working with an individual student, you would know if that's something that you would see or would not see. Okay, we are Can I see your packet? Thank you. Okay, and it is, I'm just trying to decide if we should start this now or take a break first. It's 10:35, and we're going to show the video clip. I mean, we could do the first part of it and then take a break and come back and do the second part of it. Okay. Daniel, do you want to come up here for this part? We're going to let you guys get a little practice on some data collection. So we have a video clip, and we're going to have you watch it and kind of identify a certain student. Daniel was kind enough to put this together for us, so do you want to explain the first part of this?
We're going to show a video, and if you have it on your computers, it might be easier, but you will see it up on the board. Just the first time, you're not going to be collecting any data. All you're going to do is just watch, identify a kid, pick a target behavior, and then as a group, write a definition for the behavior that you will be collecting data on.
Does that make sense?
There's no aggression in this class, so just to make it easier for you, it's probably going to be off-task behavior. It's only 5 minutes long, so we aren't going to actually use this later for our graphing. This is just practice. I'm just looking at a group of kids, picking a kid, saying, oh, well, you know, let's call, you know, he's a head scratcher, or he's off-task behavior, or whatever, and then write a definition for that.
Okay, so it's going to be a group of kindergarten students, and they're in a semicircle formation, and we want you to watch them for the, you'll have the whole 5 minutes to determine what student you want to focus on and what behavior you're going to look at. Wait.
Everyone see this? That's why we hope that, did anyone download it for on your laptop?
It was not sent to them ahead of today.
Oh, was it? Okay.
It is a
On
YouTube.
a flash drive, we could pass the flash drive around.
I saw the YouTube address.
What the YouTube address for?
It's on your PowerPoint if you wanted to try to load it for yourself.
Then is everybody going to be listening? Like the volume's going to be all different for everybody?
Yeah, it's in Chinese, so you don't need the volume.
It's in Chinese.
It is.
It's illegal, I guess, in America.
Visual only.
We'll wait just another minute for those who are going to try to watch on their own.
Which tables have a laptop?
I think almost everybody has one. All right, here we go. Ready? Identify your student and identify the behavior that you want to chart on. That's as big as it can go.